there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being unable to find love, but from having decided, quietly and completely, that love, as it actually exists, is simply not worth the risk of looking for. This is the story of a sculptor who made exactly that decision, and who poured every ounce of longing he refused to offer any living woman into a block of ivory instead, carving it night after night into a shape so perfect, so exactly what he believed a woman ought to be, that he eventually forgot it was stone at all and fell in love with it as though it could love him back. Tonight, we follow Pygmalion and the statue he carved and named and dressed and prayed over, and ask what it means to love an image so completely that reality itself finally has to answer, one way or another. We touched on a version of this same danger once before in the story of Narcissus, who fell in love with nothing more than his own reflection in still water. But Pygmalion's story takes a very different turn from that one, and it is worth following all the way to its end to understand exactly why. To understand why Pygmalion had given up on real women so completely by the time he ever picked up his chisel with this particular purpose in mind. We must go back a little to the island of Cyprus, where he lived and worked as a sculptor of considerable skill, and to a strange and troubling story that the old poets tell just before his own, as though setting the stage for exactly the kind of disillusionment that would eventually drive him to his workshop, and to nothing but his workshop. On that same island lived a group of women called the Propoetides, and they had committed, in the eyes of the goddess Aphrodite, an offense that the goddess of love was never inclined to forgive lightly. They had denied her divinity outright, refusing to honor her as a goddess at all, and Aphrodite, whose fury at slighted worship we have already seen fall upon mortals more than once on this channel, punished them in a manner calculated to strip away everything about them that had once seemed womanly or desirable. She hardened their hearts and their shame together until they lost all sense of modesty, and were driven, the old tellings say, into a life of open and shameless prostitution on the streets of the very city where they had once been respected. And as their hearts hardened further still, the old poets tell us, their very blood seemed to cool and thicken, until at last their whole bodies turned entirely to stone, the softness of a woman transformed, in a punishment both literal and symbolic at once, into something as hard and unfeeling as the very sin the goddess had accused them of. Pygmalion, living and working in that same city, watched this whole grim transformation unfold around him, and drew from it a conclusion that would shape the whole rest of his life. He looked at the Propoetides, and at every other woman he encountered, who seemed, in his own increasingly bitter judgment, to carry some trace of the same faults that had doomed them. And he decided that womankind as a whole could simply, to offer the kind of pure and unblemished devotion he found himself longing for. It is worth pausing on the particular unfairness buried in that conclusion, because the story does not entirely let Pygmalion off the hook for it, even as it goes on to reward him so extraordinarily in the end. He judged an entire sex by the punishment visited upon a handful of women who had wronged a goddess, and rather than risk his own heart on any real woman, who might, after all, prove imperfect or unfaithful or simply human, in some ordinary and forgivable way, he withdrew from the whole business of courtship entirely, and resolved to live out his life alone, unmarried, untroubled by the messy and unpredictable business of loving another actual person. But a heart built for loving something does not simply stop wanting to love because its owner has decided the risk is too great. and Pygmalion's own considerable skill as a sculptor gave him an outlet that few other lonely men of his age would ever have had available to them. He began to carve, in a great block of pure white ivory, the shape of a woman, not any particular woman he had ever known or admired, but an idea of one, gathered together out of every quality he found himself longing for, and had decided, bitterly, that no living woman he had ever actually met seemed to possess. He worked on her, slowly, and with a devotion that the old poets describe almost as a kind of courtship in itself, shaping the curve of her arm, and the fall of her hair, and the particular softness at the corner of her mouth, over weeks and then months, refining and refining until the figure beneath his hands seemed less like a carved object and more like a living woman who simply happened, for the moment, to be standing perfectly and patiently still. And here the story turns from an ordinary tale of a craftsman's skill into something stranger and more unsettling, because Pygmalion's devotion to his own creation did not end when the carving itself was finished. He looked upon the statue he had made, and found in it a beauty so complete, so exactly and precisely what he had always wanted, and never found in any living woman, that he began slowly, and then with growing and undeniable intensity, to fall in love with it. He touched the ivory figure, often the old poets tell us, checking again and again whether it was truly stone beneath his fingers or whether some warmth of real flesh might, impossibly, be hiding there instead. He brought her gifts, the small and tender offerings a suitor might bring to any woman he was courting, shells and polished stones and small birds and flowers, gathered fresh each morning, laying them at her feet, as though she might, at any moment, notice them and be pleased. He dressed her in fine robes, and hung jewels at her throat and wrists, and set rings upon her carved fingers, and each evening he laid her gently upon a couch, draped with the softest coverings he could find, propping soft cushions beneath her head, as though she might otherwise, resting on bare stone, catch some kind of chill. He spoke to her. He confided in her the way a man confides in a companion he trusts completely, precisely because she could never once answer back, never once disagree with him, never once reveal herself to be anything other than exactly what his own imagination had already decided she was. It would be easy, hearing this much of the story, to feel only pity for Pygmalion, or perhaps a certain unease at a devotion so thoroughly one-sided, so entirely built upon a silence that could never once challenge or surprise him. And the old poets, telling this tale, do not entirely spare him that discomfort. There is something genuinely strange, even faintly sorrowful, in a grown man addressing gifts and confidences to a piece of ivory night after night, mistaking his own carved perfection for a companionship no real woman had ever been permitted the chance to offer him. But the story does not leave him trapped in that lonely and one-sided devotion forever. For there came, each year on the island of Cyprus, a great festival in honor of Aphrodite herself, the goddess of love, and the whole city gathered to make offerings and to ask the goddess for whatever blessing each supplicant most desired. And Pygmalion, among the crowd of celebrants at her altar, found himself, almost despite his own carefully guarded heart, praying for something he had never quite allowed himself to admit, wanting out loud before. He did not dare ask the goddess directly for the impossible thing he actually wanted, for even in the privacy of his own heart, he understood how strange and how hopeless such a request would sound spoken plainly. So he asked instead, carefully and indirectly, for a wife who would resemble his ivory statue as closely as any living woman possibly could. hoping, perhaps, that some real woman somewhere might simply happen to share her features closely enough to satisfy a longing he still could not bring himself to name outright. But Aphrodite, goddess of love, who understood the true shape of every heart that came before her altar far better than the careful words those hearts actually spoke aloud, heard the real prayer hiding underneath the one Pygmalion had actually dared to voice, and she was moved by it, not offended, as she had been by the Propoetides' outright denial of her, but genuinely touched by the depth and the strange purity of a devotion that had poured itself so completely into a single unreachable object. As a sign of her favor, the sacred flame upon her altar, the old poets tell us, leapt up 3 times of its own accord as Pygmalion made his offering, though he himself, too lost in his own private longing to notice omens, walked home from the festival with no idea at all that his prayer had actually been heard, let alone that it was already quietly beginning to be answered. He returned to his workshop that evening, and went, as he always did, to the ivory figure resting on her couch, and leaned down to press his lips to hers exactly as he had done so many times before, expecting nothing more than the familiar cool and unyielding touch of stone. And this time, the old poets tell us, in one of the most quietly astonishing moments in the whole of Greek and Roman myth, her lips felt warm. Startled and scarcely daring to trust his own senses, Pygmalion drew back and looked at her more closely, and touched her again, his hand moving across the surface of her arm, where the ivory had always before been cool and hard beneath his fingers, and found it giving, now, ever so slightly, the way real flesh gives beneath a gentle touch, softening under his hand, like wax growing warm and pliable in sunlight. He pressed his fingers to her wrist, hardly breathing, and felt, beneath the skin that had been stone only moments before, the unmistakable and living flutter of a pulse. The transformation, once it began, did not stop at warmth and softness alone. Color rose into cheeks that had been pale white ivory only minutes before. The eyes, which had stared with a sculptor's perfect blankness for so many months, blinked and focused, and found Pygmalion's own face bent over her in astonishment, and looked back at him, not with the fixed and permanent expression he had carved into her so many months before, but with the shifting, living, entirely unpredictable awareness of a woman waking for the very first time into a world she had never before had eyes to see. She sat up. She was alive. Aphrodite, moved by a devotion Pygmalion himself had barely understood he was even asking her to answer, had granted the statue true and complete life, transforming ivory into flesh and blood exactly as thoroughly as she had once transformed the Propoetides, living flesh, into unfeeling stone. The very same power, worked now in the opposite and far gentler direction, undoing the punishment of one story by granting the miracle of another. Pygmalion named her Galatea, though it is worth noting that this particular name, so familiar now to anyone who knows this story, does not actually appear in the very oldest tellings, and was attached to her only by later poets, retelling the tale across the centuries that followed, as though even the story itself could not quite bear to leave so central a figure entirely nameless, once she had finally been given the chance to live. Whatever we choose to call her, she and Pygmalion were married soon after, with Aphrodite herself, the old poets tell us, blessing the wedding she had made possible in the first place. And in time they had a daughter together, a girl named Paphos, whose own name would eventually be given to a city on the island of Cyprus, a city sacred, fittingly enough, to the very goddess of love, whose single act of mercy had made the whole family's existence possible in the first place. It is worth pausing here, before we close this story, to consider what actually distinguishes Pygmalion's tale from Narcissus's, because on the surface the two stories seem to rhyme with an uncomfortable closeness. Both men, in their own ways, fell in love with something that could not, by its very nature, love them back. Narcissus with a reflection that could only ever mirror exactly what he himself did, and Pygmalion with a statue that could only ever remain exactly as silent and as motionless as he had carved it. But where Narcissus's love could never be anything other than a closed and endless loop, forever admiring itself and never once reaching outward toward anything genuinely separate from his own desire. Pygmalion's devotion, however strange and however one-sided it began, was always reaching toward something beyond himself, even if he could not yet name or fully understand what that reaching actually wanted. He gave gifts to a figure that could not yet receive them. He confided in a silence that could not yet answer. He prayed in the end for a real and living companionship, even if he could only bring himself to ask for it indirectly, through the careful language of resemblance rather than the plain and vulnerable language of true desire. And it was precisely that reaching, however imperfectly expressed, that Aphrodite finally chose to answer. Not because Pygmalion's love was already perfect, but because it was, underneath all its strangeness, genuinely aimed at connection rather than merely at his own reflection. And the goddess of love, more than any other power in the whole of these old myths, understood the difference between the two. There is a quieter and more uncomfortable question worth sitting with, too, before we let this story rest entirely, and it belongs to Galatea herself, whose own voice the old poets never once give us across the whole span of this tale. We do not know what she thought, waking for the first time into a life and a marriage that had already been shaped entirely around one man's private longing, before she had ever drawn a single breath to have any longing of her own. The old story, telling this tale as a triumph of devotion rewarded, does not pause to ask that question, and perhaps it could not have, in the age that first told it, in quite the way a listener today might want it asked. But it is worth noticing quietly, as we carry this story forward into our own understanding of it, that even the most beautifully rewarded devotion in these old tales was still, at its root, a man shaping a woman into precisely the image he wanted before she was ever given the chance to become anyone else, a detail the old poets left mostly unexamined, but one that later centuries of readers, thinking again about the strange miracle at the center of this tale, have never quite been able to stop wondering about. And so we return, at the end, to the question this whole strange and tender story was quietly built to ask. What separates a love that only admires its own reflection from a love that is genuinely reaching, however clumsily, toward something beyond itself? Pygmalion began this story convinced that real women could not be trusted with his heart, and poured that entire heart instead into a shape he could control completely, expecting nothing in return but the silent and permanent perfection he had carved into her with his own hands. And yet even there, in the depths of that carefully guarded and thoroughly one-sided devotion, something in him was still reaching outward rather than merely inward, praying, however indirectly, for a companionship he could not simply carve into existence himself, no matter how skilled his hands had become. It was that reaching, and not the perfection of the statue itself, that a goddess of love finally chose to answer. Real love, this story suggests, gently and a little strangely, does not begin with finding something already perfect. It begins with wanting, even imperfectly, even fearfully, to reach past your own control towards someone who might, in the end, surprise you by becoming someone the sculptor never quite planned. Rest now. Let the old workshop on that quiet island fall still at last, its chisels laid aside. And, somewhere within it, if the story is true, let warmth still be settling gently into stone grown suddenly, wonderfully alive.